Hello. So I am going to show you today some tips and tricks for applying the LimeLife by Alcone Perfect Foundation. Just so you know, there are so many ways you can apply this. You can get light coverage, you can get medium coverage, you can get full coverage. You can turn it into your like BB cream tinted moisturizer. There's tips for oily skin. There's tips for maturing skin. There's tips for blurring out pores. So I'm going to share all of that cram-packed into this video so it's easy to watch and you can walk away with some things to try to find your perfect application method. There might be a bit of a learning curve with this foundation for you because the formula is a little different than probably anything else you've ever tried, which is what makes it so awesome. But you may have to play around with a couple of different methods. I know I did when I was first wearing it. Once I found the way I loved it, then like it truly was like a done deal. I've been loyal to this foundation for 5 years now. So I'm going to walk you through steps from getting the lightest coverage to the fullest coverage, the different application techniques, and then different tips and tricks for oily skin, large pores, and that sort of thing. Right here I have the Perfect Foundation palette that comes with the 2 concealers. I love this one. It's a lot of bang for your buck. And I usually get a brightener concealer and a skin tone match. But right here, I'm going to show you how we can use some foundation to scrape it out and make like a BB cream, CC cream, tinted moisturizer. It depends on what you mix it with in order what you want to call it when it's mixed. And I'll explain that in just a second. But you're going to use like the back of a brush like this and just work with a little bit until you understand and know how much you want to work with. So I'm just working with a very little bit right here. And then I can use like my due date facial oil. I could also just put my regular old Skin Therapy moisturizer in on there. I could also take my facial SPF and mix that in. It's just whatever you prefer to do. We're going to mix it with the Skin Therapy moisturizer just to make like a tinted moisturizer. So I've got the little bit of foundation, I've got the little bit of Skin Therapy, and I'm just going to work it around on the back of my hand and on my fingers. I would probably need to get a little bit more foundation. But again, while you're figuring out how much you like to use, if you like this method, less is more. You can always add to it, but you don't want to scrape out too much and then waste it. So as you can see, I just mixed it together and I have a bit of a tinted moisturizer, just a really light coverage to give my face some color. And I would just put that all around until it got to what I wanted it to be, if I wanted super light coverage. So this is a great option in the summer, or if you're someone who just likes that super light natural look, but just wants a little color correction. So that's the lightest method. Another lightened up method you can use if you want a more sheer coverage, but a little more than that BBCC cream type coverage is you get a dampened Blenderful sponge. As you can see, this is my much loved Blenderful. It's wet. I put it under the sink. I got it completely soaked and I wrung out the water. So now it's just dampened. This is a dry one. Sorry, you're probably gonna hear dogs in the background and kids and all the things. So it gets much bigger when it's wet. A dry is going to be more for full coverage, and we'll come back to that one in a minute. But for a dampened one, you go into your foundation, and I just do a little like a quarter turn, and then like a bouncing motion. I knew I was going to demo these, and I knew I was going to forget my my primer spray. Hold on. Primer and setting spray are the bee's knees. If you've ever painted your fingernails with only nail polish and they chipped off like that, but then you use a base coat and a top coat and they last longer, that's exactly what priming and setting spray does for you. I do want to side note, if you use a primer other than LimeLife's, that's totally fine. Make sure it's water-based though. A lot of primers have silicone. Silicone does not play well with this foundation. It'll do the opposite of what you want your primer to do. So make sure you use a water-based primer, water-based setting spray. That's what LimeLife's are. Okay, so back to this. I just did the little quarter turn and then I'm kind of bouncing it around. So this is getting me a pretty sheer coverage, but as you can see, it's evening out my color. I can still see some of my freckles through there, but it's evening out my color and giving me just a really pretty coverage. That's with the dampened Blenderful sponge. Okay, so kind of stepping it up into a medium type coverage. This is where I would use my finger to use my foundation, and I'm gonna just kind of swipe it around. I'm gonna demo on different parts of my face today. So I would do this all over my face for a medium coverage, and I would use something like the buffer brush or The diffuser brush, this is just basically a bigger version of the buffer. I usually prefer the buffer brush because I can get around the little areas, eyebrows and stuff really well. This is especially good if you have large pores, and I'll show you that in a minute. But I would swipe that foundation around on my face. This foundation actually loves to get warmed up with the skin. It gets super creamy, and just swipe it all around. And then you would use your buffer brush or diffuser brush, some sort of brush with a fluffy head like that. And you're just gonna buff it in. It goes on really pretty. You get a medium coverage. It's very blendable and it works really nicely. That's typically what I do on a day-to-day basis. Now, if I want very full coverage, say I'm going on a date or I'm getting glammed up for a special event, then there's a couple of methods that I recommend for that, but I'm going to tell you, be careful, because I was used to other brands, as you probably are before I used this. I wasn't used to not having to use so much product. So I dug my brush into this and buffed it on for full coverage, and it was way too much makeup on my face. It is over 50% pigmented, so you don't need a lot of product, and that's exactly why your foundation is gonna last you 4 to 6 months. I've had a couple of clients lately tell me theirs has lasted 7 months or more, so that's pretty cool too. But less is more. So for full coverage, use a light hand. You go straight into this with the dry brush. So you're picking up a little bit more than what I did swiping it around. And then I would still do the same buffing motions and buff it in. Okay. And so I would just be careful about going in with a light hand and buffing it in and making sure I'm blending really, really well. With a dry sponge, I'm not going to use this particular one because this one's clean. But you would go kind of like I did with the dampened, little quarter turn, do the bouncing motions rather than swiping. Swiping's not going to get you the great coverage you want, plus it's not the best for your skin and it just doesn't apply it in the best way. So do the bouncing motion all around, and then if you have porous areas and you used the sponge, you're going to want to find some sort of brush where you can stipple into those porous areas. And what I mean by that is, I have some pores on my nose that I like to cover. If I go straight over the pores with a sponge, you can see the pores. But if I take my brush and I do some little stipple in motions like this, then I am able to blur out those pores, because it literally kind of just puts it into the pore. This is non-comedogenic, so even if you're kind of pushing that foundation into the pore to blur it out, you're not clogging your pores. It's not going to cause a breakout for you. It literally is just a way to blur your porous areas. So even if you're using a sponge, I recommend having a brush too, just to help with any porous areas. There are foundation brushes like this that are very flat, kind of like a paintbrush. You can use that with this foundation. It's going to be a pretty light coverage that way, and it's definitely not my preferred method. I would either do wet sponge, dry sponge, or some sort of fluffy brush in the techniques I've shown you. Now, just a couple of tips. If you are maturing skin and you have fine lines and wrinkles, if I'm going to put foundation or concealer under my eye, I'm only going to use one of them. I'm not going to use both of them. I usually prefer to use some concealer. I put it in a thin layer, and then I immediately set it with our translucent setting powder, which is colorless. Off camera, I went ahead and put my concealer under this eye, and I did some blush and bronzer, but I want to also show you how I apply my concealer. Now, I mentioned earlier the flat foundation brush I don't love for the foundation. I do love it for the concealer. It's perfect for doing your under eyes, and I'll show you how I do mine. So I normally kind of tap into the brightener concealer and the skin tone match concealer. And typically I do my concealer after foundation. That's kind of how it's meant to be done, even though I did it backwards for so many years. The exception is if you're using a color correcting concealer, like we have one with a green tint that might be correcting redness, you would put that under your foundation. But if you're trying to cover a blemish or some more spots on your face, some discoloration that the foundation didn't cover, you would put your concealer on top of that for the best coverage. So I just tapped into both of those for what I'm doing under my eye. And I actually just kind of tap into my eye like this, again with a very thin layer. Notice I kind of flipped my brush around to the side that didn't have product on it, and I'm just getting that really smoothed out. And what I do, I usually just make sure with my finger that we're all crease free, and then take my little baby blender full, rub it in my powder, and just kind of set it. You do have to be careful with powder under the eyes. As we age, that can accentuate wrinkles and fine lines. But I have found if I just do it with a light layer of this pressed powder and not a loose powder, it does really well. And then I just kind of brush it away. And that's how I do my concealer under my eyes. Then we will finish up with some setting spray. I let that dry, and then I take a little bit of my pressed powder again, and I just come and take the shine out of the areas I don't want any shine. And those little fine lines, smile lines I have and whatnot, I powder those and I get this kind of soft blurred out look. One quick tip for my oily skin people, or if you ever get shiny throughout the day, the best way to take that shine out is to get a clean facial tissue, like a Clinics or something, and just press it into the shiny areas and kind of absorb that excess oil or that excess shine. And then after that, you may be looking fresh and good to go and not need anything else, or you can put a little more translucent powder on top of that. I do recommend absorbing that oil out and before you powder, because it's just going to help you have a fresher look. This method works super awesome. So again, if you get oily or shiny during the day, get a clean tissue, gently dab or pat it, kind of absorbs it out for you, and then you can use a little powder on top of that if you need to. So hopefully you love it. If you have any questions or you need any help at all, I am here to help you find your best method so that you can love the skin you're in. Have a great day.